Hi everyone, welcome back to the Enlightenment Now series where we're looking at Steven Pinker's book of that very name. So far in previous episodes we looked at a number of issues in which Pinker has argued we have made tremendous progress over the past 250 years in things like life expectancy, health, sustenance, wealth, inequality, the environment. In this episode we're going to look at three issues in one, namely peace, safety and terrorism. And of course Pinker tells a very similar story when it comes to all these things. He says that we've made amazing progress throughout modernity. Things used to be much worse, even if you wouldn't know it through looking at the news. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to also ask, even if this is true, even if the world did used to be a much more violent, much more dangerous place, are we doing enough now in terms of creating a more peaceful world? So in this chapter on peace, Pinker is drawing significantly from his previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, A History of Violence and Humanity. And Pinker kind of takes a number of steps to show that war and conflict have declined from 1800 despite the fact that we have had 2 world wars since. So he does this in a kind of number of steps. The first step is that to show that the world's great powers are no longer in conflict. So it used to be that nation states and empires that owned the majority of the world's military resources were kind of constantly warring against each other. The world wars were kind of the first instance that we've seen of, the last instance that we've seen of this. He also notes that wars between nation states are now much less common. He notes that wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia and Ukraine, and North and South Korea are the only wars of this kind since 2011 that we've seen. And in general, kind of added up, we see conflict around the globe as reduced to an area between Nigeria and Pakistan, about 1/6 of the world's population, when it used to be much greater. Now obviously this is still a huge amount of the world's population. I'm not saying that well, it just is too big an area and too many people to rest content with. But Pinker's point, as usual, is to acknowledge just how worse things were in the past. Now you might object here that this is a bit wordplay-y and playing around with definitions. Presumably civil wars are still equally as important. You might look towards Syria and the refugee crisis we have today. But even that, Pinker says, could be much worse than it is. He notes previous civil wars in Angola, Chad, India, Iran, Peru and Sri Lanka, all of which produced each on over 500,000 deaths. When it comes to refugees, 10 million people were displaced by the Bangladesh War of Independence, 14 million by the partition of India, 60 million by World War II. So his point isn't that we should think that Syria is fine in comparison. His point is that when we're looking historically at the world isn't in crisis. Syria is, and we should treat it independently, and we should go about putting our efforts into ending the Syria war and refugee crisis in ways that we've learned to do so from the past. So why has war declined in this way? Pinker puts it down to a combination of trade, democracy, economic development, peacekeeping forces, international laws and norms. Collectively, these reduce the incentives to go to war. There's a kind of economic logic to this, right? When people trade and become precious, peace is better for everyone in the long term. So Pinker has this kind of vision of a future world which is united by economic productivity, trade and prosperity. A world that has basically overcome problems we looked at before, like pestilence, like hunger and poverty, but has also overcome war and conflict. So that's Pinker's take on war and peace. We've previously seen what his thoughts are in terms of infectious diseases and other illnesses that kill people, but it's important to note that other people kill people on a day-to-day basis without having to be at war with each other, and also people die as a result of natural disasters and accidents. So how have these things fared over modernity as well? Well, you might have guessed, Pinker shows that pretty much from this time, kind of from the 14th century onwards, these areas of danger and safety have been steadily getting better. So he notes that from the 14th century onwards, disputes between people in Western Europe were settled in less violent ways. So what is called the King's Peace put an end to things like feuding, pillaging, warlording. From the 19th century onwards, we had a more professionalised criminal justice system and municipal police force, a more deliberative court system. Now, again, this is something that is currently far from perfect, but it's much better than what preceded it. Then Pinker kind of talks about other areas of safety and danger in life. He points towards how car accidents have become considerably less frequent in wealthy countries over the past century, due to various innovations in car safety, various driving regulations. Just think of seatbelts, for example, airbags. He shows that poorer nations like India, China, Brazil, and Nigeria have death rates that are double that of the United States, that are 7 times that of Sweden. He shows that being a pedestrian is also safer. 6 times as many pedestrian deaths in the US a century ago than there is now. So Pinker's point is that this may not kind of be the big sort of Nobel Prize winning victories of humanity, but nonetheless we are steadily chipping away at the risks of simply being alive. After car crashes in modern states, the likeliest causes of accidental deaths are falls, drownings, fires, and poisonings. All of these factors are in decline. Occupational deaths, deaths caused by natural disasters, are also decreasing with the help of technological innovations and better regulation. One exception is that drug overdoses are going up. Also, drug-fueled violence remains an unsolved international problem. Pinker does note that this could be solved through the steady decriminalisation of drugs and well-regulated drug industries in place of the lawless ones that we've currently got. That's great, and unfortunately progress in this area seems to be relatively slow. So these reductions in risk, in dangers, these wins in safety may not seem that important, but actually accidents kill more people than all but the worst wars. The same is true of homicide, which has gone down considerably too. So we kind of, I think this is a sort of general background of life that I think we fail to recognise. I think Pinker's point here is really strong, though it is just simply much safer being alive today. There are less accidental deaths, even if these breakthroughs in safety don't make the headlines. And one sort of counter example to this, something that does make the headlines, even if it doesn't necessarily have much of an impact on our lives, is terrorism, and that's what we're going to look at next. So Pinker's chapter on terrorism is actually the first chapter that is different to any of the other ones that preceded it. He doesn't look at how terrorism has been decreasing over the past couple of centuries. In fact, he actually does the opposite. He says the reason why we now care about terrorism so much is because the world is such a better place. We simply just don't have the wars, we don't have the homicides, we don't have the accidents, the natural disasters that or the catastrophic natural disasters that would normally take up our attention. And he kind of tries to put numbers to this. So he says, in the US and Western Europe, for example, in 2015, accidents killed a total of 262,000 people. Homicide killed almost 20,000 people. In contrast, terrorism killed a total of 219 people. Another way of putting this is in the US, you're 3,000 times as likely to die in an accident than a terrorist attack. He notes that outside of the US and Western Europe, terrorism is much more of a problem. This is mostly because modern wars that aren't between nation states are often classified as acts of terrorism, such as conflicts in Syria, in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan and Libya. Pinker points out that these conflicts can be effectively ended, as we've already discussed in his chapter on War and Peace. So Pinker kind of goes even stronger here and says, actually, it's not just that terrorism kills less people, that it's kind of a non-issue when it comes to progress, but also it's a symptom of the progress we've made. So he references actually Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, where Harari talks about how in the Middle Ages, every sector of society basically had a private militia. So aristocrats, guilds, towns, even churches and monasteries had their own security force where they secured their interests. We no longer live in a world where local acts of violence are how things are run and are the norm. Instead, we effectively have modern states which have a monopoly on violence. And that means that the rate of killing within borders has been driven down, leaving effectively terrorism as the only potential for violence left. So Pinker's point is that not only do we pay more attention to terrorism because there's kind of less bad stuff going on in the world, but actually the fact that terrorism exists shows that we no longer have as much violence within our borders either. This is all very well, but I think there's still an issue that Pinker fails to address, as we've seen in other chapters, time and time again, and we'll be finishing on that one next. So what is it that Pinker is missing here? What's his blind spot? Firstly, the reason why I've bracketed these chapters on peace, on safety, and on terrorism together is because I largely agree with what Pinker is saying here. I think the picture he is painting of the world is a largely accurate one. I think the statistics pretty much speak for themselves. But he also notes that we clearly have far more progress to do in this area. You know, the fact that there are still what he calls minor conflicts around the world, or the fact that there's still terrorism around the world, shows that there are clearly areas around the globe, large proportions of the population, where trade and prosperity have not yet been spread to. And Pinker notes that, you know, we know the solutions to these problems. He's painted his vision of a world in which there are no longer wars and other kinds of conflicts. But what he doesn't say is whether we're doing enough. It's all very well to say we have a solution to end civil wars like Syria, but rather than following that up with we should therefore be putting all our efforts into ending the civil war in Syria, he just doesn't go there. Pinker, I think, tends to think of himself more as a knowledge guy. Here are the trends, here is what's possible, but doesn't see any reason to advocate for changes to be made quicker than they currently are. He kind of thinks that, well, eventually all these major problems will be solved because we've solved them in the past. But why is that a good argument? Why should so many people have to die before ending the war in Syria if we know how to do that? Why should we rest pretty much content with terrorism when we know that it's a symptom that prosperity hasn't reached various parts of the globe? So I think in addition to everything Pinker says, we need to think not just how we will eventually solve these problems and have a kind of faith that we will continue to do so, but actually think, okay, well, if we have the capacity to solve these problems and we eventually will do so, how can we do it quicker? How can we devote even more resources? How can we devote this knowledge in even more concentrated ways? Pinker's vision of a future world in which there is no pestilence, hunger, poverty, and war is great, but I want to see more from that vision. It feels more like Pinker is kind of content in having the vision and relatively complacent to all the suffering and deaths that exist in the world right now. So that would be a major criticism of everything Pinker says, even if I do agree with his general portrayal of where we've come from and of where we're going. I want to know why we can't get to a better world quicker.